Good morning, and my guest today is Dr. Antonio Garcia, who has written the book South Africa and United Nations Peacekeeping, Offensive Operations Conceptual Models, former officer in the South African National Defense Force, visiting scholar formerly at New York University, Stellenbosch University, and currently in Scotland at that I don't know.
So thanks so much for that. Well, so still with Stellenbosch University and currently working in the civil service. And
very good. Very
good. Academics on the side.
Right. So my first question is, Doctor, in light of the dissolution of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, we had Dominique de Villepin say that America now was a hyperpower. And now 20 years on from that statement, we seem to be moving into we're going from a unipolar world back to a multipolar world. How does what seems to be a fait accompli in that regard, how would that affect the proposals for, let's say, the broader proposal for offensive UN peacekeeping operations in the present day, if that were to be happening and if that were to take place?
Thanks. Well, a good question. I think so. In light of all that's happening in the world, the war in Ukraine, looking at what's happening at China just at the moment with Taiwan,
right.
Many militaries and many nation states putting forward, their power base, the military showing what they can do, and using that as becoming global players, sort of like in the old way in the 20th century. So I would say it becomes a little bit complicated with offensive operations, and I think because it starts with the P5 of the Security Council. And so
for those who don't know, if I could just, that's the five permanent members.
Yeah. That's right. So basically the victors of the Second World War. And so the US, the UK, I always forget one when I list them. So so the US, the UK, we have China, we have France, and we have Russia. Right. And basically, in order to get that mandate to achieve that peacekeeping mission, say in this case with an offensive element, which is very rare, to be honest, in a peacekeeping sense. It's used a couple of times, and well, you might want to discuss a few of the case studies as we go on. So each of the power players there of the P5 could just veto it. So if it's in an area where, let's say, Russia has an interest, they might say, well, we're going to veto this, so you won't get a UN mandate for it. And of course, becomes complicated, and we can maybe go into that whole discussion of, well, there have been operations where certain, say for example, US or UK-backed forces did started a war, or there was a mission or coalition-led offensive without a full UN mandate, and what that in turn then means for countries' territorial integrity and so on. So in short, to answer that question, I would say it comes down to those, we kind of enter that phase of a deadlock again, in a similar way to the Cold War, where you might find more regional powers having influence, or such as NATO or regional alliances, and then also Russia and China in their different ways. However, in Africa, you find a couple of missions with offensive mandates, such as in Congo, with the FIB. In Mali, for example, you also find that the UN mission, up until recently, supported the offensive operations. Right now, with the French withdrawing, it's a little bit different, but the G5s are still there. And so, just a couple of examples of where you do have offensive mandates. But in the broader picture, we do find a fully UN-backed offensive operation probably being very limited going forward.
Right. You mentioned, I just wanted to touch on the one subject. You mentioned the air mobility aspect. And you mentioned that in the United States in Vietnam put this to some great effect. Whether there was any effect on the overall picture is debatable. But I did want to ask you, Because I seem to recall that Rhodesia, during their war against the, Robert Mugabe against the Rhodesian government, the U.S. seemed to take hints from how they used helicopters. Would that be fair to say that was the case?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those wars, sort of colonial and liberation wars in Southern Africa, had a strong air mobility component. Yeah, and the U.S. then formed the kind of air cavalry used in Vietnam. Yeah, I try to draw a comparison. So what happened, perhaps in the FIB, putting a lens over it, saying that maybe they need a bit more of an air component to be able to some of those far off areas, at the end of a very long, line of communication. So how do you in fact do that force projection? How could you perhaps do that force projection? And then of course using helicopters and battleships, it does help. As you said earlier, it's a good point. So that answers perhaps a tactical question. How does that translate into a strategic answer? That one's maybe a bit more complicated. One, as we know with Vietnam, as part of the bigger geostrategic question, it wasn't successful for the US on that occasion, and books has been written about that. In the case of the FIB in Congo, also not some initial successes, but after, despite the question of the air component, not much success against some of the.
Right. Is it the case, would you say, in reading your book, I sort of made a lot of assumptions in the sense that it seems to be implied that obviously there would need to be, and I'll just touch on what you mentioned. You mentioned the militarists in the UN, and I thought I made the assumption that a lot of what, you do have the Force Intervention Brigade in the Congo, but would there need to be a lot of change or fundamental change in the United Nations in terms of having a continuous ability to engage in offensive operations? Would there need to be some complete change in mindset in that regard?
Yeah, there would be. I think there's generally a big aversion to using force to the settlement of disputes, and the UN will consider itself, an international organization made up by its members. So rather say it's up to a region, maybe the NATO, maybe the African Union. It might say those elements could consider using force, or even a substructure like SADC or the G5 Sahel being an example from West Africa, to use that force as they see fit within the limits of international law. And the UN, it also depends on the people in charge. So we touched on Kofi Annan earlier, a pre-chat, and in certain he was of the opinion, having lived through a lot of the early experiences of the UN, that you need a credible force if you want to make a change. So if there's a genocide, let's say in Rwanda, it's only through a credible force that you can stop that, and that was the case with Kagame and the RPF. Whether it's right or wrong, it came off the back of a civil war, and he put very strongly, if the genocide doesn't end, we're going back to war, and that's what he did, coming out of Uganda and then fighting, and that effectively is what ended that genocide. And in similar Bosnia, with Srebrenica, we know there was this terrible genocide on the European, continent, and it was ultimately that NATO-led effort that led to that ending. Of course, there was ground forces assisting with that. We had Rupert Smith from the UK also doing a tremendous. But I'm just trying to bring forward that point that even if the UN cannot in itself, force or bring it to bear, or put the mechanisms in place, it can partner with regional organizations.
It can rally.
I'm a bit tangent on the question, but just trying to.
No, that's okay. I mean, I intended to cover just a little bit, because the idea was, when you mentioned NATO and how would something like that? Should the United Nations ever, let's say, you mentioned quite a bit of it in your book with regard to having an independent command staff. I'm paraphrasing you, but having it seemed to be, for instance, let's for argument's sake say there was United Nations Military Academy that trained officers, and would we're talking about in the future, right? So would something like that then, should the United Nations have a robust ability to engage in offensive operations or peacekeeping enforcement, if you like, would that in the future, in your opinion, obviate the need for an organization like NATO, for example?
So I think, NATO being one of the most, I see your question, and I think the UN, it might be able to put in certain standards, for offensive operations or certain theoretical elements, or be able to certify, certain nation states that want to contribute to that operation.
I see.
We are going to do the following, and I need a credible force, or we need a credible force with the following. And the NATO, I think NATO would always be there because it's one of, as we have it, one of the longest defensive, bodies and associations and pacts or alliances that we have ever had in history, and extremely successful in many ways. And I mean, that has its own history, I suppose. Europe was
exactly.
full big brother US in, so you have that cover, or the EU has, or Europe has that cover. But I think the UN would rather perhaps have a way of certifying the different nation states who are the true contributing countries. I think they would, perhaps there was an argument way back that should we have a standing, should the UN standing army? And because of the different, ideologies, opinions, all the different member states, they would say no. I would say it would just be important that each member state considers what they get into with that and what they would have to do to, to push that forward. And the limits of that would most likely be some sort of tactical operation. Like counterinsurgency or anything like that would be a bit of a sticky wicket and, a little bit more complicated, as we've seen, the history of guerrilla war and so on. So I think the UN will want to stay out of that, ensure a credible force where needed with the limits of the use of force. And then also, of course, this ties in with the principles of peacekeeping, right? Like, at some point, are we compromising those? And then, allow each nation state to train their own forces and deploy them under the UN flag as needed or mandated.
Just as a point of reference, I'm thinking here far into the future. So I was just, because this entire idea has intrigued me, and that what you mentioned, the principles of peacekeeping, leads me to my next question. In the present day, with something like the Force Intervention Brigade, do you think there is a risk? Because, the UN is always seen as a neutral arbiter, right? Not taking sides, and tremendous credibility in that regard alone, at least, I believe. Do you think that something like the FIB, the Force Intervention Brigade, or even limited offensive operations against guerrilla groups or armed groups does degrade to a certain extent the UN's credibility as a neutral arbiter?
Yeah, it does. So it's one of those cases where you compromise between principles and practice. So you would say, if the principles of peacekeeping is consent, so we need consent from the host government to come in, and then we're going to say non-use of force, excepting in defense of the mandate. So that becomes a bit, there's a whole evolution of how that came to be.
Right.
And the last one being neutrality. So of course, if you're fighting on the side of the government, how neutral are you in fact?
Right.
And the counter argument is, if that use of force protects civilians, so there's a innocent groups of people, whether in villages or towns or wherever, being killed and being massacred, and that use of force protects them in the physical sense, gives them a protective boundary and stops the armed groups from coming forward. Is that okay? Does that justify it? So it's this compromise between, are you neutral, and then are you on the side of the state? So in many cases, it's it's a complex security situation. You have all these armed groups. Each one has perhaps a different interest. Some might be economic, some might be self-defense, some might be political. So, others might just be protecting an area for the exploitation of mineral resources, or economic again. So if you know what I mean, so it's this complex set of circumstances. So those principles, it's hard to be a purist almost on any of them.
Of course. Well, interestingly, you mentioned of course, in your book, it's right in the title, South Africa and the African battle space. So how does something like, for instance, there has been talk of the African, well, just like with Europe, has been thinking of a rapid or quick reaction force outside of NATO or whatever. So the African Union, formerly the Organization of African Unity, I think is the title, and they moved to being the AU. How does in the African battle space or on the African continent, how would the formation of, let's say, a African Union army, or maybe, for example, looking at ECOMOG, which was part of ECOWAS. ECOMOG was a credible force at certain times, but other times they were accused of certain things. But my question is, how does something like that, how would the UN operate in that type of environment where, let's say, the African Union had its own rapid reaction force, if you will?
Yeah, again, a good question, and what underpins your question is the idea of interoperability. Right. So when NATO deploys, for example, they know someone from Spain, the US, whoever, they can pretty much work together. And the operations, tactics, techniques, similar, and they would have drilled it in. So now if we take the African example, the African battle space, or the so-called African battle space, so right. we think, what kind of conflicts will we encounter? Most likely, there are some sort of insurgencies, and whether that's the case of Congo, Central African Republic, or now Mozambique too. Right. I just mentioned a few. Of course, is that the Ethiopia and the Tigray region. That's there are so many lists, but in this case, you will most likely find regional actors coming together. So with Mozambique over the last couple of years, they've put together a force of which South Africa is also one of the key contributors, and mostly comprised of special forces and a couple of units. It might be paratroopers, some elite, other supporting, so that's comprised mostly of SADC units. So some from Rwanda, some from South Africa, and those countries would say, who have the interest, the regional interest, would say, right, we need to get this under control for security reasons, so we can stabilize and continue with trade and all the other things. Of course, a complex issue, the military just being one element, and then in that case, there isn't really a UN mission deployed with that offensive element in Mozambique, but if we take Mali, for example, we do have a UN mission over there. And in line with that, we have a regional force called the G5 Sahel, who's doing some of the fighting and in support. So in that case, you have the two elements operating separately, but there's a sharing of information and also of resources to a certain extent. Most times you'll find, and I say, obviously I can be corrected on this, with the formation of the FIB, it was formed by regional actors and then put into the peacekeeping mission, most of it relates to resource issues, and even the G5 wanted to be part of the UN mission because it's to do with resources and being able to have that logistical financial support. So at the moment, that's the way the African Union approaches it, using its member states, and they form alliances, to cater to the different conflicts or to address them. And then often that's besides the UN mission. It could be without a UN mission or integrated within. In the case of the FIB,
right. This is interesting, and I just want to, before I continue on that, I want to ask you, with regard to what you wrote here, in the level of risk that contributing countries are willing to assume. And you also mentioned, I think it might have been in your book, where peacekeeping has always been assumed to be no or very low risk to the lives of soldiers. And you mentioned South Africa specifically with regard to the level of tolerance of the public for casualties, if you will. How do you think, and South Africa, it's South Africa, I believe you wrote Tanzania and Mali in the Force Intervention Brigade. Is that correct? FIB, was that correct?
Yeah, Tanzania and Malawi.
Malawi, I'm sorry, my apologies.
No.
And I imagine South Africa being the biggest contributor in that grouping. What is the South African public's attitude? And I ask this only because I spoke with the previous man I interviewed, this major who was anti-weapons of mass destruction person at CENTCOM, and he said, that's a real question. He said that how much a country is willing to tolerate in terms of losses for a greater good, so to speak. And so I'm familiar with the American public's attitude toward these things. They don't really think about them because the issue is sort of sanitized for them. But what about South Africa? When you have casualties, how do the South African people feel about that and their country being a major, not the question of the contribution, but in the contribution there being casualties? Is this something that makes them say, why are we doing this? This is silly, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the case in the battle in Central African Republic was telling. So they were basically, about one platoon either of casualties killed and or injured, and it was a tremendous battle. And what happened? And this wasn't a full peacekeeping mission. This was a fight between the two countries, and immediately the South African military withdrew. And the response from the public was very much like, what were we doing there?
I see.
What were our boys and girls, our sons and daughters doing there? Why?
Right.
And I think there's in the US, and again, for me to be corrected, but in the early 90s with Somalia and Mogadishu, sort of the Black Hawk Down, all that. So with
of course. Yep.
It was a US led, but also UN supported mission. And fair enough, there was some initial success with humanitarian corridors and all that. But when the scope creep happened and, pushing maybe the change of theme or influencing the political structure and all, general idea, and this massive battle ensued and, maybe a Pyrrhic victory. But of course, US public also, it was like, excuse me, but what is this about?
Right, exactly. There was recently a case with Niger where, if you remember that, I think 2 or 3 years ago, where those troops were ambushed, and the reaction I'm sure you heard it, was even in the U.S. Senate, senators were saying, we didn't know troops were operating in this region. Do you have an element of that here? Again, just asking about South Africa, where the political leadership sort of does not inform the public of what's going on.
I think so. I think the political narrative, just on your earlier point about where forces operate, so whether it's US or UK or Russian, special forces are really everywhere. It's
right.
They're not far behind, and we are privy to that. So definitely a shock when it happens. But no, I think so. On your earlier question about politicians, I don't think many politicians in South Africa. So I'm going to sort of interrupt myself and go back to your earlier point.
Go ahead.
Just to give it the full,
Sure.
So AU comes about, OAU has served its purpose, as you said. So decolonialization is completed. AU now takes on the idea of African Renaissance. Thabo Mbeki, our second democratic president, sort of leading this charge. And so this is his idea, or a group of other people too.
Sure.
In Nigeria, and so they have this idea of an African Renaissance, and then not many presidents after him, and politicians sort of take on this kind of international view of South Africa's role in Africa. And I'm not saying no one does, but for the most part, it's consumed, like with many countries, with local issues.
Right.
The services, corruption, nitpicking, infighting, all that kind of stuff. And that's very where it's remained, where South Africa does a tremendous job within Africa, not only in the sphere, but diplomatically too, and economically. And unfortunately, many people aren't aware of that. Luckily for the FIB, just to tie into that, question, the casualties aren't that high, and as a result, it kind of flies below the radar, and things just go along. And there hasn't been any major offensive since the M23, 2013. But now, interestingly, a decade later, and I made mention of it just in passing in my book, that if you don't follow it up with a political action, your victory becomes nothing, because you've got to speak to them and say, listen, come to the table, disarm, become part of our forces, security reform, whatever. And now they're fighting again in the East, and this is push. For the last couple of weeks, there've been protests and some very poor actions also by the peacekeepers there. And so we see this change happening at the moment in Congo, where now the president and others want the peacekeeping mission out. So loads of pieces coming together there. Well,
what I found interesting was you mentioned it briefly, Sierra Leone, and when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General, there was a lot of discussion about private military contractors. And interestingly, and I wanted to ask you about this, in Sierra Leone, as you know, executive outcomes, but I did not know until I was doing some research for this interview, was that the fee that they charged, which was $1.8 million per month, was paid by the IMF on behalf of the Sierra Leone government. What role in something like the Force Intervention Brigade, because of, for example, you mentioned successors to Thabo Mbeki, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which Jacob Zuma, Cyril Ramaphosa, with their less, let's say, larger view of things. What role do you think something like private military contractors could play in something like a standing Force Intervention Brigade, let's say, UN Force Intervention Brigade?
Well, okay, that's a big question, yeah. So
just on a surface level.
On the surface, that's no, cool. So I just want to say, just on that point, so Thabo Mbeki, yes. Jacob Zuma, no. Cyril Ramaphosa, I want to just add one thing. He's got a very interesting history, and even Jacob Zuma, to his credit, there's lots of points in the negative for him, and plenty, there's and rulings against him. But in terms of diplomacy and negotiation with other countries, he did play a role, and Cyril Ramaphosa also has as a record of good negotiation and abilities. And this ties back to what he did in the struggle for the ANC and so on. But okay, and I just want to add a little bit about them. And
I wasn't denigrating them. I just was saying.
Oh no, absolutely.
I want to be clear. No.
I didn't take it like that. I just want to
add context. Okay.
Absolutely. Well, it didn't come across like that. So, I think the private military companies, it's a very sensitive one, and the UN will probably not go for it. You said, indirectly, you might find a country paying for it, or even by the IMF. But directly, they wouldn't do it, just because it's such bad publicity, and as we saw now we see with the Wagner Group working with certain group, in Africa with certain countries, and atrocities committed. There's just such a difficult thing to balance, because you can't assure human rights standards, discipline, and all those things, because operating and I'm not saying, also I want to be careful, I'm not saying that every private military company.
Oh no.
Of
course.
Yeah,
I'm thinking in the macro sense, and in the future, where people might, where again you might have a, like for instance, I think if I'm correct, we have, in just as an example, in Europe or in Germany, they have professional jurors. You know, you have a finance case, you have finance people. Here we have just the general public. So I was thinking of it on that level, where, you know, the UN this might never come to pass, something like a standing ability for the UN. But maybe there would be a situation where, you know, because I think it wasn't until I remember the article in the Financial Times when I think when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General, when terrorism was finally defined, there was a piece in the, you know what I mean, in a book sense.
Sure.
So I'm just thinking in the future, do you think there would be something that those elements would serve, in other words?
Yeah, I think so. They could, like certain things could be perhaps delegated. So I think even the US uses private security companies
Sure.
to cater for so the security and guard duties
Right.
and like that.
Right.
But I think for the UN it would be a little bit challenging to get in private military companies. So the UN is bad at a lot of things, right?
Right.
They battle at a lot of things because of it's such a big talk shop, right? Like there's just
Sure.
interest in everyone. But what it is good at is spreading this idea that we can have a better tomorrow. And I don't mean, again, to put my foot in it and denigrate, the good work, because the agencies do tremendous work, whether it's
Of
UN,
course, absolutely. UNDP and everybody,
yeah. So they do tremendous work, and operationally they're good for their size and what they are able, the footprint that they have. But in terms, like you said earlier, on the macro scale, what the UN can do, it's to sell this idea that we don't want another world war, and
Right.
it still does sell that, and it says maybe with Ukraine now we've got to be careful a little bit,
right.
And to the UN's credit, again, it's done good work in brokering this deal to get the grain out. So
right.
it's good, there's good parts in it, and then of course there are limits. But taking this concept that that they are spreading this idea or the ideation of a better world, I think they would struggle with the private military contractors unless and I think, as you said, thinking to the future. I'm not saying there's no, of course, what do I know? The space force, right? But then I would imagine, again, they would have to put very defined standards that you would need a human rights check on everyone that serves. So even legitimate former security person that now serves in a given capacity, why if it leads to greater efficiency, and for it may be the way forward, where we have a sort of a generic force, and I think I did like the idea. I think it was vetoed back in the day, just that every country has the interests. And of course, the idea of a force commanded purely by the UN, given its political nature, an organization made up by member states, there are just so many questions to answer. But I think just because it's complex doesn't mean we shouldn't evaluate it.
Right. Let me ask you this. Obviously, you mentioned the good work the United Nations does and this issue with Ukraine, with the negotiating the grain release. Do you think there is some certain amount of undervaluing of the work the UN does in that regard? For instance, this is a good example, getting the grain released. Do you think on a general level, there is some undervaluing of the UN's ability to bring people together to find solutions to sometimes complex problems, which involve military or which don't involve the military?
Yeah, I think it is undervalued. I think because when the UN, if I can say, you're such a large body, so there's subgroups within it, but when there are mistakes, they are massive. So I name a few. So in Haiti, the cholera, and the sexual abuse and exploitation. So when there are this big issues and crimes, they take the headlines, and rightfully so, because you've seen they've done damage, whereas the first principle is do no harm. So that kind of just muddies everything. But yeah, we shouldn't, and not that not you, but all of us, we should also just take a moment and think of all the really good work that it does in operations, refugees. Cambodia, it had a caretaker government from the UN that was negotiated after the Namibia. They are, and those were specific style of peacekeeping missions a certain time, but really, really good work that was done on a big scale. Peru would be a success story too, and perhaps even if you look at the emergency force in Sinai, 1956, the kind of this kind of changing nature of peacekeeping to, earlier you said it was pretty, there was no risks. You had military observers, and this was maybe the first time things got a bit more complicated. And so I think there was good, settlements when you had people like Kofi Annan getting directly involved in dispute negotiations and mediation. But then, of course, the failures, we can't get away from them. Srebrenica.
Well, no, of course, sure.
And so it's this kind of balancing act, and trying to get this broad view of all of it.
Well, when I have these discussions and people talk about what you just said, failures, I always say, well, what government doesn't have massive failures? So I think in the context of, how things work, it's not like me dropping a cup of coffee when a government makes a mistake. So, I mean, that's, I think, should be part of the realization on the part of people, I should say, that everybody, these organizations, no organization is perfect. I wanted to ask you something about we talked about this earlier, the 5 permanent members, they all have a veto, and you have the rest of them are rotating. And I know that, I should say, there's been, for the last 20 plus years, discussion of reforming the Security Council and moving away from its, this has nothing specific to do with your book, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what you would think would constitute a more, how shall we say, representative UN of the world as it is today, let's say.
It's a brilliant question, and I know there's lots of debate, and my opinion is that it is due for a change. I know exactly what that change is, but it's definitely, we definitely have to consider what that change looks like for the future. So we hear the voices of people that are perhaps underrepresented, and bring issues to the fore that's not just of the big 5, right? Because that big 5 controls the power, and a lot of the big systems of the world. I don't want to say all the capital, but a lot of it is there, most of it probably, and so. We China, US, so yeah.
Right. Well, it's not in my bank account, that's for sure. So.
and I think we'll just see more of the same, right? And I think in practical terms, it will be hard to change because it came about for a particular reason. A world war that really changed the landscape of the modern world, and in order to change it, it will be difficult, because you have all the people in the pound seat saying, well, they don't even have to say I'm the boss. It just goes without saying. So but I think in order for there to be a change, it's just as our norms change, as we have new generations that come forward, and and we have maybe a situation that forces the change. With COVID, we saw that where events forced people to work together, and climate might be the next one, or is the next one. It's just a case of how acute that is. If it's kind of the long game, people tend to, as humans, we tend to drag our feet, so that's what I would hope for the future, that we would have more of those voices coming in, and perhaps that the veto and that the power of the P5 can be spread out a bit wider, and all following some amount of analysis, some sort of research which will say what could possibly give a better a better system.
Right. I'm going to close with this question, and with in that regard, is it important, or I should say, I say it's important to, if we think about those possible future changes, that the UN must maintain its relevance in the 21st century. And I think you mentioned it, the negotiating of the release of the grain. And I frankly would like to see, this is my personal feeling, I would like to see obviously an end to the conflict with Russia and Ukraine, but I would like to see the United Nations involved in resolving that conflict. And would you say that maintaining their relevance is vital moving forward as we continue into the 21st century?
Yeah.
They're not irrelevant, as some people have said already.
Oh no. Oh no, the UN is not irrelevant. No, it's yeah. I can see why people get annoyed and frustrated.
Right.
But I agree with you. It's so vital that it remains relevant. Right. It's so vital that they, that when I say them, the UN and us, we evolve.
Yes.
And so, the UN made some efforts, and there's always the backdoor, conversation and discussions happening. And the Secretary General going to Ukraine and also to Russia. And it's so important. I mean, the idea of interstate conflict, many theory academics have said, oh, it's over.
Yes, that's right.
History, whatever. And I'm not trying to take anyone out of context there, because
no, sure.
But this is, it's so serious that it kind of flies in the face of the work of the UN for the last, almost 80 years. And so it is vital that it reevaluates priorities, that it evolves. And, key to this is having good people, like genuinely, you need those star players, whether it's Sergio, Kofi Annan, whoever, maybe Antonio Guterres is taking that role now, we'll see.
Yes.
And that's key, to have that interlocutors that can know what to do, how to position things, because just having the right person at the correct political moment, I think, just in my opinion, can move things in a certain direction. And, it's a case of taking that active stance, you can't do it from the comfort of your office. You can't do it, that's a different role. You need to be out there, and you need to be engaging, and over time, not only that particular person, but their staff is building up those relationships. So when it comes to where you have some credit in the bank, that you can say, look, let's have a conversation and see if there's some common ground that we can build on. So in short, the gains that can be made, I think, are in the practical senses, like the grain leaving. Perhaps something practical to do with some sort of logistical agreement, to do with, there are other areas like that, and then that can be built upon. Unfortunately, the conflict itself, we're dealing with some complicated actors, and it's not the time for a peace treaty yet, because
no. I was just saying that I believe I would like to see, the UN play. I would like to see them play a role, if not the lead role, in bringing the belligerents, if you will, to the table.
Yes.
Because I think that, and I think, as you mentioned just now, with the current Secretary General Gutierrez, I think he's met his moment to a certain extent, and I think he's met it very well up to date. I think he's done the right thing and struck the right balance. And I think, especially in light of what you just said, the complexities involved in these interstate conflicts, or conflicts between these various nations, which you alluded to, Francis Fukuyama, the history is over now, the Soviet Union is gone. And well, that shows you the danger of predictions. But I think it's important. And when I speak with fellow people, it's amazing to me how little use the average person has for the United Nations, and in America, I should say. And I think, that's disappointing, because I always try to say, things don't happen, as you kind of alluded to, instantaneously. You have to dialogue is always better. And if the UN is engaged in that regard, I think hopefully they will. And listen, you're 40, I'm 57. A peaceful world is a better world, no matter how you slice it. You know,
that's you said it really well. Yeah, I think yeah, the regardless of, I think, well, you know, America is just such a big place, you know. So you know, I think so. And with many powerful countries, the UN kind of applies to, you know, to other people. That was my experience when I was with
yes,
the
it's
US.
true. Yes,
You know, and I say it respectfully,
sure.
because the US has every institution needed, you know, to
Right,
cater for almost everything,
right,
and yeah, and so for the people that criticize the UN, or think there's no need for it, you know, you know, I don't think there's anything we can do excepting to ask them to engage with what's happening in the world and the literature and speak to
right,
some, because you know, I think there's no better alternative at the moment.
right, right. Would it be fair to say in closing that in regards to things like this, on the large level, Russia, Ukraine, and smaller conflicts, it doesn't really matter. It's not a question of taking sides. It's a question of settling the dispute. And you don't necessarily, would it be fair to say you don't necessarily have to take a side to settle a dispute? You can just, you know, I always say, and maybe I'm being a little wordy here, but in America, we have this winner take all approach. And I've always looked at European politics, particularly in Germany, as a consensus. You know, I want X, you want Z, but we agree on Y, right? And I think that you don't really have to have an opinion on who is right or wrong to settle a dispute. You just have to be able to have dialogue. Would it be fair to say that that's almost in every situation the case?
Yeah, I think so. I think so. I think, you know, whether you are resolving a conflict or some element of a conflict, like refugees, and they are
Right,
examples where you had, you know, we mentioned earlier Sergio de Mello, and when he was in Cambodia, he engaged with the Khmer Rouge, and he
right,
did it. It was almost like a maverick, right? He just said, "Well, I'm doing
right,
it," and
right,
it was, many of his counterparts were like, "Are you nuts? You know, all the human
right,
rights abuses and the genocide," and he said, "Right,
right,
well." And he got the results, right? And
right,
uh,
right,
so I think that's just some evidence to your point that it was a case of not looking at people as, you know, black and white, or
right.
one thing, but the complexity of the human being, and where's that element that we can, you know, work together to get this result that we want. I'm not saying it's for every situation, but
No,
I do think that that it's needed in order to get people around the table to, you know,
yeah.
to, otherwise we'll constantly, you know, have that kind of, you know, that difference of opinion, and there's no way to bridge it.
Well, yes, and now we're really close. But De Mello was a tragic loss, and I think a great example. And I was a big fan of his, and I think exactly that shows that, you know what? Yes, you know, these people are bad people or have done bad things, but that doesn't mean we can't talk, and we have to talk, because if otherwise, it's just continuation of the status quo, which nobody wants. So I think that's how I think people should try and look at the world. And I think the UN is relevant and hope and continues to remain relevant. And that I think people should, you know, pay heed to what they have to say, because it's important.
I agree with all of that. And yeah, he was the rock star of that
Right.
world. And
Yeah.
like you said, absolutely tragic loss.
Unbelievable. Well, Dr. Garcia, I want to thank you for your time. And it was a pleasure to see you, even though we haven't met before, but maybe we have, we never know. And and I hope that we can possibly do something like this again. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, Will. It was a pleasure to speak to you today, and would love to have some further talks.
Thank you.